In today's episode, Chloe and I talk with Cody Jussel. Cody works with adaptive athletes in both CrossFit and Pilates. And with Cody, we talk about the history of the Paralympics and what the para means in Paralympics. We talk about how some of the mechanics of how to work with adaptive clients in a Pilates context, and also just discuss the body's amazing adaptability and some of the really cool things being done by adaptive athletes around the world and how you can find out more about that. So all that plus a bunch more coming up. Hey, Chloe.
Hey, Raf, how you going?
Fucking awesome.
What a way to start. Hey, Cody.
Hi, Chloe.
Nice to have you here. I've been very excited about this.
It's really awesome to be here. I am also super excited.
I'm a huge Cody fan, so this is got Cody on the potty. Yes.
Hey, can we do a real quick, because I've been talking to some of our UK and Europe-based students and podcast listeners recently, and one of the things that I've learned is that we're kind of over the top, like enthusiastic, everything's awesome, everything's amazing, because if you're British, it's more like, how are you? Like, oh yeah, not too bad.
Yeah.
You know? So can we do the more like, can we do like the European edition podcast intro?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Chloe, how's it going?
I'm all right, Raf.
Hey,
Is that
Katie,
good?
what's up?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Not bad.
You know, there's other
shabby.
things I could be doing now, but this will do.
Shout out to our European listeners. We love you. Oh, sorry, we don't hate you too much.
Your love's a bit over the top, Raf. You're all right. Oh, that's fun. That's way more fun than fucking awesome. I'm down with it. Yeah, because do you know what? We can only go up from here. So I think maybe that we're fucking awesome peaks too early. So, you know, this is maybe a new thing. Brought me down a couple of tones.
Let's see where it takes us. So, Cody, can you introduce yourself to the folks at home and just share with us whatever it is that you want to share about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So I am in Santa Cruz, California. And I have taught Pilates in various locations in different capacities for about 15 years. I recently was, I feel like forced to open my own studio is like not the exact way I want to say it, but COVID has like ushered me in this direction of having opened my own studio in the last year.
And is your studio at home? Is it at your?
Is.
It is, right? That's so cool.
Yeah. Which is like kind of the coolest thing. Raph, when you say you're like living your best life in lockdown, I also feel a very similar way where I was like, I feel like, I'm a little bit of an introvert by nature. And so like hunkering down at home was right in my nature. But it also like kind of, thrust me in this direction of opening my home studio and like primarily working online for the most part in the initial phases of COVID. And like now I never want to go back. It's like I love working from home. I love working steps from my refrigerator. Snacks available all the time. Most important thing. But also just like doing something that I didn't think I was really ready for. I didn't even really know that I ever wanted to do, which was have my own space. So that's been really cool to explore. And it's just me in my house, which gets lonely. And I'm so excited to also be a trainer for Breathe Education. Because I feel like now I'm also a part of a community of people and not just like alone by myself, which feels really good. So I went through a couple Pilates training programs and then felt like well, really, I'm just kind of a junkie for school, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, like just, you know, getting certification after certification after certification. But it did prompt me to want to get my master's in kinesiology, which I did a few years ago. And I focused in orthopedic rehab and adaptive sports, which was kind of like the doorway that just opened my world to adaptive athletics. The woman who created the program at my graduate school was a physical therapist for the Paralympics in Rio, I think in 2016. And as far as I know, it's the only graduate program in kinesiology in the country for adaptive sports. And because she was really focused in the Paralympics, the focus of the program was really centered around the Paralympics, and kind of like Paralympic classification and just like the general workings of how that system works, Paralympic history, the Paralympic movement. But, you know, we got a lot of like just basic kind of like, you know, this is what she was giving examples of, like, this is what she does when she works and trains with adaptive athletes. And so it was a lot of like very much like the diploma program that Breathe does. It's, you know, a lot of like, so you have, you know, this hypothetical adaptive client, like build a program for them. What would you do? And, you know, it's just kind of drawn out into a much longer, a 2-year program. So that was really my introduction to working with adaptive athletes. And then simultaneously, I got involved in CrossFit. And CrossFit is one of, I mean, I might be misstating this, but one of the most inclusive forms or inclusive modalities that I've encountered that is not just inclusive of everybody, but is specifically inclusive of the adaptive community. And so when I was doing my master's program and like kind of just entering into this sphere of, you know, what is an adaptive athlete, I was also entering into this new to me sphere of CrossFit, where they were saying like, hey, we're making programs for adaptive athletes. And that was really, it made me want to get more involved in CrossFit, along with it being like the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. And so that's kind of how and then there, you know, there's a little network of Pilates folks in the Bay Area who are doing some really neat stuff with adaptive athletes. And so all of those things were kind of swirling around in my world at the same time. And that kind of thrust me in the direction that I am still currently following, which is working with adaptive athletes, being involved in CrossFit, being involved in Pilates, and kind of that's where all of those potentially unlikely worlds collide for me.
It's so cool, Cody. It really, I hadn't been exposed much to adaptive athletes apart from, you know, watching the Paralympics, etc., but not in the sense of, you know, the CrossFit Games or working with clients in a Pilates setting. And you and your social media and what you're putting, you know, what you're putting up in your Insta stories, etc., really sparked my interest and kind of opened up a new world to me, which I'm excited for you to open up for I'm sure this is going to be the same for a lot of our listeners. And when you tagged the page I Am Adaptive, that page for me, so that's on Instagram, I Am Adaptive, and I do believe we might have mentioned that in an earlier podcast after I came across it, thanks to Cody, and it really just blew my mind on just how epic human beings are and what they're capable of is freaking phenomenal. I think what would be really helpful, which I know it was really helpful for me and also for the training team, our Breathe Education training team, Cody, was when you gave us a little, a talk about like what is the definition of adaptive, because it's not a term. I know it might be a term that's used quite regularly in the States, but most of us in Australia hadn't heard that term before. So could you flesh that out a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that we refer to adaptive in the States, or what we mean when we say adaptive in the States, is somebody who has a permanent impairment. And that could be like spinal cord injury. It could be an acquired impairment, as in like, you got into an accident and acquired spinal cord injury, or needed to have an amputation and acquired limb loss. But the definition, according to law in the United States, is that it's a permanent impairment, but then that also translates into how we classify people for competitive sport in adaptive athletics, is that to qualify, it's not like, oh yeah, I had a knee replacement this year and I don't quite have full range of motion left, or don't have full range of motion yet. And so I'm going to classify myself as adaptive. For sport and competitive sport, it needs to be a permanent impairment.
Right. And is it neurological as well? So it's either physical.
Yeah.
That's right? So, for instance...
Correct. Yeah,
could you give
it
some
could be so physical as well as neurological.
Okay. Yeah.
And so neuroadaptive athlete is a whole category or whole classification of athletes that then have kind of sub-classifications within the neuroadaptive division. So a neuroadaptive athlete might be somebody who has a spinal cord injury.
Right, okay.
A neuroadaptive athlete might also be somebody who has CP, cerebral palsy, or somebody who has multiple sclerosis,
right,
or traumatic brain injury. All of those things would be classified in a neuroadaptive category, like if we were going to classify those things in a sporting context or a competitive context. And then I think when I was giving the presentation for the Breathe training team, I was trying to kind of, I realized as I was developing the presentation that my perspective was very US centered. And I was like, well, obviously there might be different laws about accessibility or, disability-based discrimination in Australia. And so what I found is that Australia has a much broader classification of adaptive that doesn't necessarily include, or it doesn't need to be a permanent impairment for the sake of the law. But I believe that if you're from Australia and you're an adaptive athlete competing in the Paralympics, it still needs to be a permanent impairment. But
right.
Yeah.
Wow. And so, Cody, can you give us, what I loved about, I feel like all our listeners are going to be like, I wish I was at that presentation. It was a really good presentation. A++++. I really loved the history, because I had no idea about the history of the Paralympics and how that started with that one particular doctor.
Yeah. So it's a really neat history that I also didn't know a lot about before I started my master's program. But the Paralympics started as, I believe they were called, the first Paralympic Games was called the Wheelchair Games. And it was held in 1954 as a local kind of expression of how this one doctor was, and I'm totally like spacing his name, and I'd have to look up his name for you. But I know it starts with a G. He
We'll just call
was
him Dr.
primarily
G.
working with, what was that?
We'll just call him Dr. G.
Yeah, Dr.
Dr.
G.
G. Perfect.
Dr. G. Dr. G was a legend.
He was working with neuroadaptive athletes, which they were just called, I think, neuro athletes or athletes with a spinal cord injury. I'm not exactly sure how he referred to people with a disability. They were all in a wheelchair at a hospital called Stokes Mandeville Hospital. And he believed that he had this very like forward thinking view of rehabilitation. And he kind of took a very biopsychosocial approach to rehabilitation where he, it wasn't just kind of like fixing a person. And I'm having a little air quotes here because it's a pretty dated way to think about our interactions with adaptive athletes, right? But he felt like, the social aspects of rehabilitation were just as important as the physical and medical aspects of rehabilitation. So, person's happiness and their social interaction with other people was just as important as, like the ability to walk again, potentially. And so he created the wheelchair games, and they were super small at first. And as they progressed and became a little bit more popular, they were developed to be the parallel Olympics or run in parallel to the Olympics. And that's what Paralympics means, is parallel Olympics. And they developed into this worldwide competition of including several different classifications of adaptive athletes. And I believe that the 2020 Paralympics had a total viewership of 4.25 billion people worldwide. Yes. Yeah, which is huge. And, I feel like he was really able to create a really forward-thinking idea of what being a Paralympian, or it wasn't called Paralympians then, but of being an adaptive athlete, where the Paralympics eventually is this incredible showcase of elite athleticism in the adaptive community. There's some really, really awesome old footage of the Stoke Mandeville Games that you can find on YouTube that's like freely available. And just little snippets of kind of those initial ideas that built the Paralympics is really amazing, really neat.
I think it got most of our team quite emotional watching that old footage. It was pretty incredible. Raf's found the doctor's name, haven't you, Raf?
Ooh, there we go.
Sir Ludwig Gutmann, according to Google.
That's the one.
Dr. G.
Dr. G. Dr. G.
Dr. G.
What a forward-thinking legend, really. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
What a game changer.
Super cool.
Super cool.
Cody, there's a couple of things that I wanted to double-click on in what you said there. I think where I'd like to first ask about is, okay, so working with adaptive athletes, so these are elite athletes, you work with them in a CrossFit context and also within a Pilates realm. So what can you share with, regular Pilates instructors who might work with non-athletes who maybe have a limb amputation or a neurological, impairment or whatever it might be? what can you share with the rest of us on how to just accommodate and challenge and work with those folk?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I think the majority of us are going to not necessarily work with elite athletes, right? We're going to work with kind of the everyday person. And so what I would say, number one, is that there's no box that you need to fit into, right? There's no right way to work with an adaptive athlete. And much like our guidelines for the general population, able-bodied people, we're not going to break anybody, right? And the guidelines that you use with able-bodied people are the same guidelines that you would use with adaptive athletes, meaning like a client walks into your studio and you want to set goals with them, right? You want to collaborate with them. You want to build strength the same way that you would build strength with an able-bodied person, right? I think that those, at least for me, when I started working with adaptive movers, that there was a lot of fear around, what if I hurt them more? Like, what if I hurt this person more? What if, I didn't even know what could happen, right? I just, the sky felt like the limit, and I kind of was, had a lot of trepidation with moving with an adaptive athlete. And you quickly realize that when you collaborate with the person that's in front of you, that, one, they'll let you know what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And I would say that as an instructor, it's super important to let go of needing to direct the show, right? It's very much a collaborative experience, I think, working with an adaptive athlete, where especially initially, they're going to tell you oh yeah, that doesn't work for me. I can't do that, right? I can't reach up and grab that thing that you want me to grab because I know that that's just not going to happen for me. Or, hey, can you prop me up while I try to move from one location to the other location, right? There's a lot of, and I think telling the person that's in front of you in those initial couple sessions, hey, let me know what you need and we can really work together. We're in this together. I think was the most important thing for me to realize when I started working with adaptive athletes is that there's no one right way to do something. You want to think very much outside the box. And sometimes people that aren't trained to work with adaptive athletes are the most creative and come up with the most interesting things, right? So the Pilates instructor that's never worked with an adaptive athlete has no idea maybe what, that group of Pilates instructors who always works with adaptive athletes, they have no idea what they do on a regular basis. And so there's this, it's wide open, right? You can do whatever you want. And maybe you come up with something that's super amazing and creative and, ticks all the boxes for the body that's in front of you. And there are some things that I think are important to know, before you work with an adaptive athlete. If the person is a neuroadaptive athlete and they have trouble regulating their temperature, what does that mean for you as an instructor? What do you need to make sure that they have water, or make sure that the environment they're in doesn't get too hot? So there are some things that I think are helpful to know, but also usually the person who you're with will say hey, I can't sit around
Right.
in
Yeah.
intense heat for a long time because I have problems regulating my temperature.
Can I ask a couple, there's actually three things I want to ask you about there. The first, and I'm just going to ask all three, and then you can kind of maybe the answers blend in together. The first one is just about alignment, right? So just say, I'm used to cueing, say we're doing 4-point kneeling, right? And I'm used to cueing everything be straight, shoulders in line with wrists, shoulders, hips in line with knees, and shoulders, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm working with someone who's missing an arm from above the elbow, right? So their 4-point kneeling is, well, number one, it's 3-point kneeling. Okay. And number two, they're probably going to have their arm more in the center of their, they're going to form a tripod with their knees and their arm, right? So all of those cues about lengthen through both sides, blah, 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 the things that we normally say kind of probably aren't going to apply to that person. And I imagine that's going to be similar in a whole bunch of, range of situations. So there's that. Okay, so how do we sort of adjust our kind of normal alignment kind of thinking and cueing? Second one is just mechanics, right? So just say I've got an above the elbow amputee and I'm teaching arms in straps. Like, well, how do we do that? Like, what do you, how do you do that with someone who doesn't have a hand to grab the strap? And the third one is asking, I guess sort of drilling more into what you just said about kind of asking questions at the start. And so, for instance, if somebody's got a spinal cord injury, depending on which level their spinal cord injury is at, they may or may not have use of things like their abdominals or their hip flexors or their lower back muscles. And so it's like, okay, well, asking like, well, can you actually sit up from lying on your back, or do you need my help with that? Or, is that something you want to work on? Or, so sort of, I guess sort of understanding the parameters of their capability and their goals, within, because spinal cord injury is not one thing, right? It's different. Someone with a C3 injury is very different to someone with, say, a T6 injury. So alignment, just the mechanics of how do you grab a strap if you don't have a hand? Or, even if you can figure out a way to grab the strap, well, you've got one arm that's half the length of the other. So how do you equalise the tension on the ropes? So how do you respond to all of that?
Yeah, awesome. Those are great questions. So I'm gonna start from the bottom up. So spinal cord injury. And yeah, no two spinal cord injuries are the same, right? Even with somebody who has like two people come in with a C6 spinal cord injury, like they may be even very different from each other. And so, yeah, understanding what the person is capable of is a little bit of trial and error. So there is a group or a network of Pilates instructors who work primarily with spinal cord injury athletes in the Bay Area. That group is called Zebrafish Neuro. And it was started by a Pilates instructor, Stephanie Comella, and one of her clients who is I think he's a C-level spinal cord injury athlete. And the way that they kind of move through movement sequences for SCI athletes follows... Are you familiar with DNS, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization?
No.
I think it was a method that was developed in the Czech Republic, I think, with Pavel Kolar. I might be saying his name wrong. Anyway, it's a movement sequence and a method that like follows the developmental sequence of a baby through toddlerhood. So, I know.
Yes, first you crawl and then you do something. Yeah,
Exactly.
I'm vaguely familiar with the concept. Yeah.
Yeah. So they use kind of that as a guideline for a lot of their SCI athletes. And so they kind of, move through, can you lie on your back? I mean, most SCI athletes really benefit from getting out of their wheelchair. Not all SCI athletes are going to be in a wheelchair, but if that is their primary means of movement, getting out of a chair is really important and really nice. And so a Pilates session is a really good way to do that. Usually, you put down a mat and you get some props and you just lay on the ground. And, you start with maybe a rolling sequence, or this is how zebrafish neuro kind of goes through their movement sequences. Starting with, the most basic thing that our nervous system can do in babyhood or in infancy, and trying to develop from there. Depending on the level of injury and movement capacity, you might, an athlete who has a high level cervical spinal cord injury is not going to have a lot of movement. And so you might stay at a very kind of like basic level of movement for a really long time, forever, right? But, when you sit down and develop those initial goals with that client or the person that's in front of you, we may assume as able-bodied people that their goals are really centered around like walking or regaining functionality. But often that's not really what a lot of adaptive athletes, SCI athletes, are after. Is they're just, most goals center around improving independence, improving their ability to perform, basic activities of daily living. And so for a lot of folks, that means just feeling better in their bodies, and doesn't necessarily have anything to do with movement. But yeah, did that answer that question?
Yeah.
I kind of,
then
that was
there's
a long-winded.
No, that's great.
I think that's really powerful, Cody. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, then there's the questions about just like alignment. How do we rethink the way we think about alignment when dealing with somebody who's maybe got an upper or lower limb amputation or some other, situation? And then finally, just the mechanics of like, how do you do legs and straps with someone with only one leg, or, whatever it might be.
Right. Totally. So alignment, yeah, it's such an interesting thing when, I held really, really tight as a Pilates instructor, held really tightly onto ideas of alignment for so long. And still catch myself like trying to like push a lot of that stuff out of my head when it's not necessary. But yeah, you are, if you have a client who is an above the elbow amputee, right? And you want to do something like 4-point kneeling, it's going to be 3-point kneeling, and, they're going to, so this is how I, for all of my clients, I give them like kind of order of operations, like task number 1, balance on one foot, or like task number 1, stay on the ball that you're balancing on, right? Don't fall off. That's just task number 1, right? So, and it has nothing to do with alignment or quality of movement or anything that myself as a Pilates instructor, kind of held as the goal for most of my Pilates career, right? And so I have learned to prioritize just the task rather than the alignment. So if I want somebody to be in 4-point kneeling and they're an above the elbow amputee, one, I might give them a prop to like a stack of yoga blocks to rest the residual limb on, so that they, could feel that 4-point kneeling position. But it's also not the end of the world, right? If they had a hand more towards the center, and we're kind of like a little bit more weighted on one knee than the other, right? Because what I want them to do is just to feel that hand and knees position without necessarily thinking about the alignment. So just complete the task, right? Just think about the task to be done. And I think that can be really powerful for not just adaptive movers, but for able-bodied people as well, right? Just like we can think about, or you can think about the, whether your hips are level or not, if you want to, but also like, does that improve your experience of this movement, or does that improve your experience of this position? Or does it just make you feel like you're unable to complete task number one when, you're trying to think about keeping your hips level, when really the only goal is just to, find this position and stay in this position.
And in fact, keeping your hips level might actually make it harder or impossible to do the task, because hips level is predicated on having two lower limbs and two upper limbs where the weight is evenly distributed. And I love one of the people that you link to on your social media, Logan Aldridge, who's an adaptive athlete in CrossFit, and we'll link to him in the show notes, but he does amazing he's a one-armed athlete, and he does amazing clean and jerk weightlifting. So he's lifting, from the looks of things, about his body weight, above his head with one arm from the floor, which just incredible. But you can't do that with your body straight, right? He has to get the weight, the center of mass of the weight, over the center of his base of support, which means he has to be kind of leaning a little bit to the side, And so if your cue to him was keep your hips level, it's like, well, that just makes it totally impossible for him to actually complete the movement.
Absolutely. And it's like it's kind of a fantastic like exercise in experimenting with what works. When you get to work with an athlete like that, there's another CrossFit athlete, Amy Bream, who is a above the knee, lower limb. She's not an amputee. She was, I believe she's talked about her story online. I think her Instagram handle is One-Legged Warrior. But she was born with one leg. And, I got to watch a lot of folks warm up for the CrossFit Games, because my area was right in like the main warm-up area for all the athletes. And so during the games, she was warming up some lifts. I can't remember what exactly she was doing, but her prosthetic like sometimes wouldn't bend at the mechanical knee joint, and the way that she was able to figure out how to pick the weight up off the ground and get it over her head, doing something like a clean and jerk where, you need to bend your knees to pick the weight up, and you also need to receive the bar in a bent knee position, right? And her knee, like her mechanical knee wouldn't always bend, and her coach would like come up behind her and like kind of push the knee sometimes to get it to bend.
Yeah, I saw her doing some, and the mechanical knee not bending, because I'm following her eagerly on social media. She's a bloody legend.
She's a beast.
She's just amazing. And I just also love her vulnerability. Like she put up the videos of her crying, with frustration, but also that sense of pushing through that ultimate frustration and coming out on top. But I noticed how, the leg wasn't bending, so she kind of just slide it straight out, and she was still getting the lift.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like,
she's amazing. I love her so much.
She's so great. Yeah. And it is, and you watch athletes like her, you watch athletes like Logan Aldridge, and you're like, oh, okay, they're just getting the task done.
Yeah. Actually,
Like
I
they're-
watched her learning. Oh, sorry, Cody, didn't mean to.
No, go
I'm so
ahead.
excited by it. I watched her learning to do. She wanted to do handstands. And she was doing it without a prosthetic. So if we're thinking about, center of gravity, etc., and she said she was actually scared of falling, right? She was scared of falling. And so her coach was like, I need you to fall so you get over the fear of falling. So it was like once she got, because she'd get upside down and, the weight was of the one leg was constantly pulling her over. And so she said she had to learn to fall. And so falling no longer scared her. And I was like, oh, this is just also fucking cool.
That's a great TED Talk story, Chloe, when you give your TED Talk. You can share that.
It is.
I just love that. And it's like, and I love, Cody, I shared the I Am Adaptive page with Adam Meekins, who we love, and then he went on to he was like, oh my God, what is this page? This is like the best thing ever. And I said, well, you got Cody to thank for sending me in that direction. And he put up a post and said, every single person who works with someone in regards to movement or rehab needs to be following this page. And the next time you think about trying to correct someone's bloody scapula or, say that their hip is slightly out of alignment and that's the root cause of their, low back pain, check yourself, like really check yourself because it's outrageous. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's pretty awesome to watch these athletes,
How do you feel when you're there? So you were assisting, weren't you, the last Adaptive CrossFit Games, is that right?
Yeah. So this was the very first year that there were adaptive divisions at the CrossFit Games. There have been independent CrossFit competitions that have included adaptive divisions for a while. Like I think Wadapalooza, that's held in Miami every year, has included adaptive divisions for quite a while. But this was the first year that they were included in the qualifying rounds of competition. So like the CrossFit the CrossFit season starts with the CrossFit Open, which is like a worldwide competition for everybody. Like anybody can join it, regardless of your level or experience or anything, right? You can sign up and you do the workouts that are put out by CrossFit headquarters. You do them at your home gym and you log your scores. And then you're put on a worldwide leaderboard of everybody who is participating in the CrossFit Open. And then the field is narrowed down from there. So until, you qualify for the CrossFit Games themselves, and then that's the main final competition. It's like the Olympics of CrossFit. Mm-hmm. And this was the first year that adaptive divisions were in the CrossFit Open and were then in the CrossFit Games. So CrossFit started in Santa Cruz. And so the gym that I go to, the CrossFit gym, was the very first CrossFit gym that ever was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
There you go. That's cool.
It just kind of happened to be in my neighborhood, and it happened to be the one that I went to. And, I just have developed a great community of people there, and I love it. Subsequently, or coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, a lot of the folks that work at CrossFit headquarters also go to the gym that I work at. And so we have seasonal employees that kind of like come on during the CrossFit Games season just to help with the volume of work that needs to be done. So since maybe 2018, I've been a seasonal employee, or a seasonal contractor, I guess. I haven't been an employee, for the CrossFit Games. And that usually carries all the way through to the games themselves. And so I was, when we are at the games as CrossFit employees, we turn into athlete control, which just means we make sure that all the athletes get to where they need to go when they need to be there. And these are 600 plus athletes.
Wow.
When we
and you're
have
like
all of the
ushering them
divisions.
around kind of situation.
Totally. Literally ushering them around.
now.
Literally going like, you people need to be here right now. And I am going to walk you over here in 10 minutes. So that's athlete control. And so this year I was kind of like the point person for the adaptive divisions. So, I would brief them every day. I would email them at night and kind of let them know what their day was going to look like the next day. And, because I had been kind of communicating with them and working with them all season long. And then at the games themselves, we were already a little bit familiar with each other. And so there were 30 adaptive athletes at the CrossFit Games this year, or this past year. And it was, it was a success as far as they were concerned, which was the most important part for us.
And how does it,
sure that they had a,
how does it leave you feeling, watching such incredible feats of adaptability and physical prowess and, how does that, how does that affect you? I feel like, you are a very empathetic, awesome human being. I'm sure, when you have experiences like I'm sure that sort of sucks into you and, how do you leave feeling from something like that?
It is incredible to watch these athletes perform at such a high level. Honestly, all of the CrossFit athletes.
Yeah, amazing.
To watch them do these things that, I am amazed that human bodies can do. Talk about grit, right?
Yeah.
I think CrossFit is a lesson in grit, and it helps people become grittier, right?
I like that.
Nobody looks at a CrossFit workout and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds like fun.
That looks like really easy.
A good time. Everybody knows that it's a few minutes or 20 minutes of hell. And that you kind of, you push yourself to places that you didn't think you could necessarily go. And it helps you, I think, develop this mindset of grit. And that's what I see in a lot of adaptive athletes at the CrossFit Games is, they've already developed grit, I think, through life, right? A lot of them have really amazing stories of either how they acquired their impairment or just their journey, with their impairment through life, and everybody has a different story. And, some people really resent the able-bodied world for being you're such an inspiration.
Right.
And they don't want to necessarily be seen in that light. So I try to check myself when I'm oh, wow, that's so inspiring. And, it does feel inspiring to me to watch people who are doing amazing things, not just in the adaptive community in CrossFit, but also, equally just in the CrossFit community. This past year, there was yeah.
Is it so? Just on that inspiration. So, is there sort of a coupling of the thought that inspiration is going hand in hand with sympathy or something there? Is that where that's
Maybe.
coming from, or
maybe?
Because it's really hard not to go to the I Am Adaptive page and not to be genuinely inspired by it, inspired by grit, inspired by adaptability, inspired by incredible physical prowess. Just
Right.
like if you go onto someone else's page and you're inspired by, an able-bodied person and you're inspired by their physical prowess or, grit or etc. But when you're saying that, it's like, we need to be mindful of, like, this is great to learn, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I think one that is, like me being an able-bodied person, I don't know that I'm the best person to elaborate
Right.
on that sentiment, but I do think that there are a lot of ways that able-bodied people can kind of be like just spectators and learners, right? About what the adaptive community, like, terminology that the adaptive community uses to, refer to different types of impairments, or, just to, like, I think it's important for able-bodied people to just be spectators about, how the adaptive community would like the able-bodied community to respond to them. And I think there are a lot of great people on social media talking about that kind of stuff.
Awesome.
In particular. There are, and I think that once you kind of like get into some of those adaptive accounts, you start to follow the thread, and you'll start to follow folks who are maybe a little bit more vocal about the politics of being adaptive in an able-bodied world, and how difficult that can be. Even though there is a lot more awareness about accessibility. And I think those are some of the ways that we as movement instructors can be really, what's the word I'm looking for? We can really embody that in how we open our space to adaptive athletes and adaptive movers, in how we understand accessibility. Are we, is our equipment far enough apart from each other that it allows space for wheelchairs to pass through? Are doorways in our facilities wide enough? Do we have accessible bathrooms? That kind of stuff. Things that, we might not walk through as able-bodied people walk through an able-bodied world, and think about the fact that, like, if there's a cabinet underneath a sink in a bathroom, it's really hard for a wheelchair to pull up to that sink and wash their hands. So, I think that I feel like I'm learning constantly from the adaptive community about, how we can be more helpful as able-bodied people. And I don't think that every adaptive person is going to be like, oh, don't call me inspiring, because that's super patronizing, or whatever the sentiment is there. I think that's that's the way that some people feel, and not necessarily the way that other people feel. And I think that those conversations are important to have between, able-bodied people and adaptive folks, where, when we start to interact more in each other's, or when we as able-bodied people start to interact more in an adaptive athlete's world, we suddenly just become aware of these things, because, we're listening to them. And, as movement instructors, like, it is our job to be empathetic and, to provide a safe space and a collaborative space for everybody who walks into our studio, or our movement space. And I think that you just, you're opened up to a whole different world and perspective when an able-bodied, or when an adaptive person comes into your studio.
Thanks for sharing that, Cody. I think that's a good place to take a short break. We'll be back soon.
One of the things that struck me before the break, Chloe, actually, is I just had a little meta moment and thinking about you and I, and The fact that I'd been just super focused on asking Cody about all the mechanics, or how do you cue alignment? What do you do for arms in straps? What do you do for someone with an above the waist spinal cord injury when they're getting up off a table? And you're all like, oh, how did that make you feel? When you're working with adaptive athletes. And yes, I just thought that was, I just noticed that about us. That I thought that was interesting.
I'm definitely about the feeling.
That's why you two make such a good pair.
And Cody was comfortable in both realms.
Yeah, and Cody, you've just got such, I don't know, I feel like I learn something from you every time we interact. You're such a great teacher, and you have such a kind way of showing all the perspectives, and yeah, you get me thinking without making me feel like, I'm wrong to have thought that, or to ask that, or to, you've got a very unique talent for that. Lucky Breathe education crew who are going to get to learn from you. You're really quite exceptional. But anyway, that was my fangirl Cody moment.
I feel like I'm the lucky one.
I really do want to go back to this question, because it is bugging the heck out of me about just mechanics, right? So
yeah.
Can I ask before you do jump into that, Raf, just because I feel like it's looping in. As you were asking Cody those questions about, what do I do if I've got an amputee or this and that, and we're thinking about the equipment, well, my mind went back to all and I don't know if they're tall tales. It's hard to kind of know with our mate Joe Pilates, isn't it? But wasn't a lot of the story, and I know maybe if you type it into Wikipedia, it's maybe the Wikipedia story, was that Joe Pilates was in fact working with adaptive clients post World War One in regards to amputations, etc., from the war. Well, that's how the story goes. Whether he made that up or whether that was true, I think is kind of murky. Whatever happened with Joe Pilates before he got to New York is kind of like, I don't know. But that's the story, right? So, I mean, I used to tell the story, Raf, before I knew to say, hey, this might be the story, as opposed to this is the story.
The old bed springs.
Well, and that in fact, like if we think about like the bednasium, which was sort of the precursor to the Cadillac, and it was about, well, okay, if we've got someone laying in bed post-amputation, that you can have one strap, put on the other foot, and that was the whole kind of, I don't know, I'm kind of going back to that with it and going, well, when we're looping now back into Pilates and working with adaptive clients, was there something about, the inception of Pilates that was, I don't know, I'm conjecturing, but that's where I'm thinking. And I'm thinking, well, is it that weird to think like, you just do the thing? Well, they grab the strap with the other hand, or they grab, what's your take on it, Cody?
Yeah. I think that, so kind of answering Raf's question and Chloe's at the same time, I think that's kind of what makes Pilates special in the adaptive, I don't know if you want to call it rehab or just movement, right? The adaptive movement world is that
I like that adaptive movement world. I like that.
Yeah, adaptive movement world, right? Me too. I think that the equipment, particularly, like the Cadillac or the trap table or whatever we're calling that piece of equipment these days, I really like the bednasium. I've actually never heard that word.
Oh, really? I'll get you a copy of the prototype.
Awesome.
I'm pretty sure it's probably in Cage Line.
I'll link to the YouTube clip in the show notes.
Where he comes out, like he rolls the blanket down and he starts doing the 100. It's pretty cool.
Totally haven't seen that one. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I think that the Pilates equipment offers a really unique opportunity for adaptive movers to experience the ability to do things movement-wise that maybe another movement modality or space does not offer. And so there's a lot of opportunity for support, right? Like the reformer, honestly, I probably work with adaptive clients least on the reformer, just because it is not quite as accommodating for, let's say, Raf's example, you have somebody who's an above the elbow amputee and you want to do hands and straps. One, if they're open to wearing their prosthetic, which a lot of folks don't really want to wear the prosthetic when they're, doing some movement because it can be quite uncomfortable. But, it is really important to work as much of the remnant of that limb that's there as possible, and to work as much of the musculature around that remnant as possible. And so, if they're open and willing to work with their prosthetic, that would kind of be like, okay, like let's do hands and straps with your prosthetic then, and then, take it off right afterwards. Or, you could, and I think this is where, if you're not trained to work with adaptive athletes, where you can get really super creative and very much collaborate with the body in front of you, where you're like, okay, well, I have this idea. Like, what if we took this, strap or like rubber band or, what are those things called? The like elastic TheraBand type things, right? Any kind of like elastic band, right? And you're like, what if we wrapped it around the back end of the reformer here, and we wrapped it around the remnant of your limb here, and you do, hand and strap over here, and you move the band over here with your remnant. There is no like one answer, other than you want to move both sides as much as you can, as equally as you can. And sometimes maybe that's like, okay, we're going to do, hands and straps on one arm over here, and now we're going to move to a different piece of equipment, and we're going to figure out how to move the other arm in a similar way, but we're just going to use other stuff.
That's such great advice. And I could see how the Cadillac would lend well to that.
Right.
And also being higher as well than a reformer. So potentially easier to get on and off.
Right. Exactly. And, because like if you're working with a spinal cord injury athlete, sometimes like a high-level spinal cord injury athlete, like one of my clients right now is a C-level athlete, and he's a big guy, and I have to move him, from the floor back to his chair at the end of a session, or help transfer him from the floor up to the Cadillac, or and it's a lot, right? Like it's I'm like, I need to figure out how to pick up a human,
right?
With who's like pretty much twice the size of myself, and so having something that is maybe more the height of his chair is a little bit easier to transfer, him to the Cadillac, but we work it out, and he helps me a lot. He's like, okay, no, if you move my chair a little bit more over here, like this is going to be easier for me to roll out of my chair and onto the floor. Or, like I very much let him kind of direct the show, and he lets me know where he wants me and how I would be most helpful. And then you kind of get a rhythm with the person, and you can be like, oh, okay, like this is a little bit easier for both of us. Great. Like this is how we're going to do this. But yeah, the Pilates equipment, and specifically the Cadillac or the Springboard or even the Coraline, which is a newer piece of equipment,
what's
are
the
really...
What I don't think I've heard of that before. What does it look like? What does it do?
The Coraline is a piece of equipment that was developed by Balance Body, I think. And it looks like a gymnastics ladder, like a stall bars ladder.
Oh, yep.
And then it has like these movable
sliders on the floor.
Yes, I know what you
sliders.
mean. Yes.
And so for a lot of folks, it's, you can get them standing with support, holding onto the ladder bar and, kind of like go through the movements of gait.
Right.
Yeah. And a lot of people who are working with SCI athletes in the Pilates sphere are well, and not even in the Pilates sphere, but like just in the general exercise sphere, are coming up with their own, like, not pieces of equipment, but they're like kind of like duct taping different things together. Not really duct taping, right? But they're like, okay, let's like use a ball here and then tie a yoga strap around that. And then let's put the arc here. And then this will support you in a way where you can go from a low kneel to a high kneel, right? Like if you're just trying to work on hip extension for an athlete that sits in a chair all day long. So there's a lot of like, there's not a ton of equipment out there that hasn't been developed by adaptive athletes for adaptive athletes. But I think that market is growing in certain spheres where you can see, like, if you follow Logan Aldrich, who Raf mentioned earlier online, he has a lot of really interesting ways that he shows how he works out both limbs. And you may have seen
lifting with a little strap on his shoulder, and I've seen him doing kind of handstand push-ups with a box under his remnant limb. Yeah, so some really, and then just kind of does one hand, other hand or other arm, kind of swaps. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and then you'll, look at somebody else's page who has the same impairment, and they might be doing something that's totally different, or like have come up with, a different piece of equipment, and they're like, oh, this is what I found that works. And so there's I think it's really exciting to kind of watch how that sphere grows. And there is a company, I believe, that primarily focuses in the CrossFit sphere, but that develops adaptive equipment like jump ropes and those straps that you saw for deadlifting and stuff like that. So there's some really neat, innovative things that are happening in that realm. And I think that it's also a possibility in the Pilates realm. It just isn't, no one has done it quite to the extent, I think, that it is currently in the CrossFit sphere, developed those pieces of assistive equipment.
Hey, there's just one thing that I want to ask you about, and it feels to me like we're almost at time, but maybe there's something else, Chloe, you want to talk about as well. But something that I know you've got an interest in, and I also have an interest in, is phantom limb pain. We talk about it in our diploma, and why we're interested in it is because there's a couple of research papers I've seen that show that up to 85% of amputees experience phantom limb pain. So it's like super common. Basically, it's the norm for the overwhelming majority of people, which is pain in the limb that's amputated. So you've had an above-the-knee amputation, so you have no knee, but you have knee pain in your amputated knee. And a lot of people experience it, according to the research that I've read anyway, that's like it's the same old sort of arthritic pain that they had in their knee before it was amputated, and it's worse in the cold, just like it was before the limb was amputated. And yeah, so I wonder, I'd just love to hear your thoughts or experiences on this phenomenon.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I'm always trying to think about it in terms of like just how we talk about like pain in the entire population, right? Like it's how we, super interesting. Most of my experience is with like reading research, and then also just like talking to people who have experienced it. A lot of folks that I've talked to have experienced it like closer to when they had their initial amputation. And in those, I don't know the exact percentage of people or when that phantom limb sensation starts to diminish, but in a lot of people, it does start to diminish over time. And the pain, it can be pain, right? Or it can be itching, or it can be like any sensation, right? Sensations of movement or sensations of like bugs crawling on your limb, like all kinds of different things. And
Gee, that would be horrible. Imagine having like an itchy foot.
Terrible.
My grandmother last year had one of her toes amputated. She's got diabetes and she'd lost some blood flow, etc. Circulation, that's the word I'm looking for. And she'd had an excessively itchy toe. The toe that got amputated was excessively itchy before it got amputated, and then it got amputated, and now she's so cranky about it and fair enough, because she's got this bloody itch that she can't scratch now. Yeah. And she says it's intense.
This is why I'm really fascinated by it, and why we talk about it in the diploma, is because there's parallels there with us, so chopping the toe off didn't fix the itch in the toe.
Right.
And it's the same phenomenon we see in people with back pain. So when we chop out the disc or fuse the vertebrae or whatever it might be, it's like there is no body part there anymore, but it still hurts, or we do radiofrequency denervation or, whatever it might be. It's like there's no nerves in there anymore, but it still hurts. And so that's why I'm really interested in this phenomenon of phantom limb pain, because obviously the pain, if the itch in your grandma's case is no longer coming from the toe, right? Because there ain't one. Yeah. So where was it coming from all along? And it's obviously it's occurring in the central nervous system, right? And so that's the thing with phantom limb pain as well. But yeah, I'm fascinated by the whole.
So are there any studies as to how to so we know it's a thing. Do we know, is there anything we can do about it?
So from what I've read, and Raf, you can correct me on this if you know more than I do about this. So there was Dr. Ramachandran started studying mirror therapy. And it is, I think, a really common treatment for or attempted treatment for phantom limb sensation, which is basically just to take the intact limb, put a mirror next to the intact limb, and watch the intact limb move. For some people, like the systematic reviews that I read about mirror therapy are that it seems to be an effective treatment, but there's still a lot more research that needs to be done, and that's kind of,
like
maybe the story with
pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that, there's research doesn't have a great explanation of why phantom limb pain occurs, right? There's a lot of theories out there about cortical remapping, and that the way that the body processes incoming sensory information and then outputs that it is somehow dysfunctional within the brain. There's just not a great explanation about why it occurs or the mechanism by which it occurs in people. But and I think that mirror therapy is, something that I think Pilates people have also talked about in the neurological sphere of maybe Mariska Breland, who does the Pilates for neurological conditions. I don't know what they teach, but in their courses. But I know that for a while, that was something that people in the Pilates sphere, maybe in the rehab sphere, were using. Not necessarily in the phantom limb pain realm, but more in the restoring neurological deficits in one limb as compared to the other limb. There's just not a ton of great research that gives us any conclusion about what works.
I'm trying to think if I hook up a little mirror for Nan and we scratch her other toe, whether that might,
give it a go.
Maybe.
whether it might help. Bless her, because I just can't imagine how frustrating that would be. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Having something that itches is annoying enough, let alone something you can't get to.
In the case of pain, Cody, you're spot on. It's like the research is very patchy and is not conclusive. Basically, we don't have a definitive answer for any form of pain, basically, phantom or otherwise. But I think phantom limb pain is such an amazing illustration that of the reality that pain is not in the body part where you experience it. Because you can experience freaking pain when there is no body part. So the pain's not in the body part. The pain's happening in your brain. And that's the same when you have an intact body part with pain in it. The pain is still happening in your brain. And so I would imagine, that the things that could be effective for phantom limb pain would be the same things that would be effective for, people with regular old low back pain or hip pain or whatever, which would be all of those things like, general physical activity and sleep and addressing stress and mental health and general physical resilience and social support and all of those other things, and with the addition of maybe mirror therapy. But actually mirror therapy is being used for regular limb pain as well. So, people with above the elbow amputations still have a brain the same as everybody else. So,
Right. And it's, like those sensory signals are still coming in and the brain is still trying to put out motor signals, right? Yeah, I think that there can be a lot that's, gleaned from just kind of how the body deals with pain in general that we could apply to that and vice versa.
Is there anything else, Chloe, that you want to talk about?
I think that was awesome. I've learned a lot from this conversation and I'm sure our listeners will as well. It was, thank you for sharing all of that with us, Cody. It's so cool. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome.
I feel like I'm learning about a realm I knew, honestly, very little about. This is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. This is so great. And what a great job we get to just talk to awesome people and learn things from them all the time.
It's pretty cool.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank you for having me. I really, really appreciated it. I had such a good time talking with you both.
Let's do the Europe friendly version now. Cody, it hasn't been too terrible talking with you. And Chloe, you're not such a bad co-host.
Thanks, Raph. You're all right.
and I've had worse jobs than this.
Nah, I think, you know what, Raph? I reckon we should just be ourselves and say that was fucking awesome. And Cody's fucking awesome. Yes. And fuck yeah.
I'm trying to be inclusive.
That's how I'd put it.
I'm really excited that I got to see the hand movements that went with fucking awesome in the beginning. Yes. That was how I always pictured it in my head, but I'm glad that it was confirmed in real life.
We didn't do any eurythmy, so we won't go into it all now, but Cody and I are both Rudolf Steiner kids, so we've got that in common, which may or may not explain some stuff. Probably just how awesome we are, right?
That's right. Exactly. It explains how totally awesome we both are.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I agree, Cody. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Raph.
Good talk, you too.